9 fortunes, 60 years, the same ending every time. From the railroad wars of the 1860s to a locked hotel suite in 1972, the industrial age built some of the largest private fortunes in history, out of railroads, gold, oil, steel, electricity, and more than once, out of nothing but paper. This is the complete story, how every one of them was built, and how every one of them came apart. Watch them in a row and the machinery stops hiding. The same lever keeps turning up in different hands. Control the thing everyone else needs, and the money follows. And the same flaw keeps ending the story. The trait that builds each fortune is the one that takes it apart. This is Rags to Riches. 9 chapters. The rise and the fall of the world's greatest fortunes. Chapter 1. The Match King. On the morning of March 12, 1932, a maid let herself into an apartment in Paris and found one of the richest men in the world lying on his bed, fully dressed, hands folded over a bullet hole in his chest. On the nightstand sat a pistol he had bought 2 hours earlier. His name was Ivar Kreuger, and at that moment he controlled 3/4 of the matches on planet Earth. He had lent more money than entire governments held. He was worth on paper billions. The problem was that last word, paper. Because within days, the world would discover that the greatest fortune of the age was a lie so enormous it would force nations to rewrite the laws of money themselves. Presidents had trusted this man. The smartest bankers alive had begged to lend to him. Your great-grandparents may have owned a piece of him. And today, almost no one knows his name. This is the story of how one quiet Swedish engineer fooled the entire world, and how all of it, every last match, turned to ash. This is the story of Ivar Kreuger, the Match King. He did not start with money. He started with ambition and a talent for telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. Ivar Kreuger was born in Sweden in 1880, the son of a small match manufacturer in a quiet town. Bright, restless, and bored, he trained as an engineer, and then he left. He chased work across America, South Africa, anywhere they were building. He sold steel. He built bridges. He learned the one skill that would define his life: how to make something look more impressive than it was. In New York, he learned a new American technique, reinforced concrete, and brought it back to Sweden. With a partner, he started a construction firm, and he made it famous with a single promise no one else dared to make: finish on time or pay the penalty yourself. He built Stockholm's stadium. He built landmarks. By his 30s, Ivar Kreuger was a wealthy, respected builder. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Because Kreuger had noticed something about his father's dull little business, the matches that everyone else had missed. A match is almost worthless. It costs a fraction of a cent. There is no glamour in it, no genius. And that, Kreuger realized, was exactly the point. Everyone needed matches. Every single day, in every country, forever. It was small, constant, invisible demand. And if one man could control the supply, all of it, he would own a tiny tax on daily life across the entire world. So he began buying up match factories, first in Sweden. Then he turned the Swedish makers into one giant company and pointed it outward at the world. But factories weren't the real weapon. The real weapon was timing. The Great War had just ended. Europe was shattered. Governments were broke, desperate, drowning in debt, and no one would lend to them. And Ivar Kreuger walked into that desperation holding a checkbook. His offer was simple and irresistible. I will lend your ruined country millions of dollars, cheaper than anyone. No strings except one. You give me a monopoly, the exclusive right to sell every match in your nation. For a desperate finance minister, it was easy money. For Kreuger, it was an empire. Country by country, the deals spread. France, Germany, Poland, Greece, Hungary, Romania, one government after another signed away its matches for Kreuger's cash. At its peak, his empire stretched across as many as 15 nations and controlled roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of all match production on Earth. He was no longer a businessman. He was a one-man international monetary fund, lending to nations from his own private fortune. World leaders treated him as a peer. He kept apartments in the great capitals, a palace of an office in Stockholm with secret buttons and phones that rang to no one. Props, to make visitors feel they were in the presence of power. But an empire that size runs on one thing: cash. Constant, enormous rivers of cash to fund the next loan, to win the next monopoly. Kreuger didn't have that kind of money. No one did. So he did something audacious. He decided to get it from the public. Kreuger turned to investors, especially in America, and he sold them paper, shares, and bonds in his companies. And to make that paper irresistible, he promised something almost no one else could: enormous, reliable dividends. Year after year, around 20%, sometimes more. Money flooded in, hundreds of millions of dollars from ordinary people and giant banks alike, all of them desperate to own a piece of the genius who never seemed to lose. There was just one problem. The profits weren't real. Kreuger's match monopolies made money, but nowhere near enough to pay the dividends he had promised. So he paid the old investors using the money pouring in from the new ones. A fortune that looked like a waterfall of profit was, underneath, simply a bucket being passed from one hand to the next. To hide the hole, he built a labyrinth, as many as 400 separate companies, shuffling money between them so no auditor could ever follow the trail. He kept the real books in his own head. And when even that wasn't enough, he committed the act that would damn him. He forged government bonds. Tens of millions of dollars in fake Italian treasury bonds, complete with forged signatures of Italian officials, which he listed as real assets. On paper, Ivar Kreuger was one of the richest men in the world. On paper, the fortune was made of paper, and paper burns. For a while, the illusion held. As long as new money kept flowing in, the machine kept turning, and no one looked too closely at the man who seemed to print gold. Then, in 1929, the market crashed. The rivers of new investment dried up overnight, and Kreuger's machine, the one that survived only by swallowing fresh cash every single day, began to starve. He did what he had always done. He kept up appearances. He borrowed in secret to pay dividends in public. He told banks his empire was solid, his assets enormous, his books impeccable. He even arranged new loans by offering, as collateral, the forged Italian bonds, pledging fake assets to borrow real money to cover earlier lies. But the hole was now too large to fill. Bankers in America and Sweden started asking the one question Kreuger could never survive: show us the cash. In March 1932, they summoned him to Paris to prove his fortune was real. He knew he couldn't. Which brings us back to that apartment in Paris. On the morning of March 12, 1932, hours before a meeting that would have exposed everything, Ivar Kreuger went out, bought a pistol, returned to his room, lay down on his bed, and shot himself through the heart. He left a note: "I have made such a mess of things that I believe this to be the best solution for all concerned." When the auditors finally opened his books, the world reeled. The man hailed as the savior of Europe had falsified hundreds of millions of dollars in assets: the fake bonds, the phantom profits, the 400 shell companies. It is still remembered as one of the largest financial frauds in history, the Kreuger crash. Fortunes evaporated. Ordinary families who had trusted the genius lost everything. The shock was so deep that it helped change the world. In its wake, the United States built the modern rules of finance: independent audits, real disclosure, the laws that created the Securities and Exchange Commission. Much of the financial honesty we now take for granted exists, in part, because one Swedish man proved how easily honesty could be faked. And Kreuger himself, he simply vanished from memory. No statues, no legend. The richest illusion of his age struck once, burned bright, and went out. Every empire in this series starts the same way, with nothing, and most of them end the same way too. This is Rags to Riches, the rise and the fall of the world's greatest fortunes. If you want to know who's next, subscribe. The following ones built even bigger and fell even harder. Chapter 2. The Erie War. You've heard that with enough money, you can buy anything. In 1868, the richest man in America set out to prove it. He tried to buy a railroad, quietly, completely, every last share. He had beaten everyone before. He was about to learn there was exactly one thing his fortune couldn't beat: a printing press. This is the story of how 3 con men kept a titan from buying a company by simply printing more of it faster than he could buy it, and how, when that wasn't enough, they bought the only thing bigger than money, the law itself. Start with the man doing the buying, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Everyone called him the Commodore. He had clawed his way up from a teenage ferryman to the most powerful businessman in the country, first in steamships, then in railroads. His method was simple and merciless. When he wanted a company, he bought its stock until he owned it, and then he owned the people inside it too. By the late 1860s, he had swallowed the railroads running into New York City. Only one prize was left: the Erie Railroad, the line that ran west into the rest of the country. Control the Erie, and Vanderbilt would control nearly all the rail traffic into the biggest city in America. He decided to take it the way he always did. He told his brokers to buy every share of Erie they could find. Money was no object. He was Cornelius Vanderbilt. The stock would run out, the company would be his, and that would be that. It should have worked. Here's why it didn't. Inside the Erie sat 3 of the most shameless operators in American history. Daniel Drew, the railroad's treasurer, a wiry old cattle trader who preyed on Sundays and swindled on weekdays. Jay Gould, quiet, brilliant, and utterly cold, the real strategist. And Jim Fisk, loud, fat, laughing, a former circus hand who treated fraud like show business. They watched Vanderbilt's brokers hoovering up Erie stock, and instead of panicking, they smiled. Because the Erie ring controlled something the Commodore couldn't: the company's own printing press. Here's the trick: follow the paper. The Erie had issued bonds that could be legally converted into new shares of stock, so Gould and his partners simply converted them. Crate after crate of brand new Erie shares, freshly printed, dropped onto the market, and Vanderbilt's brokers, under orders to buy everything, bought those too. Think about what that means. Vanderbilt was trying to buy up a fixed thing. They turned it into an infinite thing. Every time he bought a stack of shares, they printed another. Fisk said it best: as long as that printing press didn't break down, he'd give the old man all the Erie he wanted. The Commodore poured in something like $7 million and watched it vanish into paper that the other side could manufacture for the cost of ink. Vanderbilt did what powerful men do when they're losing. He went to a judge. He had a friendly New York judge issue orders against the Erie ring, injunctions, arrest warrants, the machinery of the law aimed straight at Drew, Gould, and Fisk. And for a moment it looked like the Commodore would win in the courtroom what he'd lost in the market. So the Erie ring grabbed the company's cash, millions of dollars, reportedly stuffed into bags and a trunk, and ran. They crossed the Hudson River to New Jersey, out of New York's reach, and barricaded themselves in a hotel in Jersey City. Fisk posted guards and even a small cannon on the waterfront and called it Fort Taylor. America's most important railroad was now being run by fugitives from a hotel across the river. But here's the thing about that printed stock: it was only worth fighting over if it was legal, and whether it was legal would be decided in one place: the New York State Legislature up in Albany. So that became the real battlefield. Not the market, not the courts, the lawmakers. And lawmakers, it turned out, were for sale. Jay Gould went up to Albany with a satchel full of cash, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and started handing it out to state legislators to pass a bill making all that freshly printed Erie stock legal. Vanderbilt sent his own money up to Albany to kill the bill. So for a few weeks in 1868, the lawmakers of New York sat in the middle and let 2 of the richest men in America bid against each other for their votes. One observer joked that a legislator could be bought. The only question was by whom, and for how much. In the end, Gould simply outbid the Commodore. The legislature passed the bill. The printed stock became legal. The fraud was now the law. Vanderbilt knew when he was beaten. He settled, took a payout to make the war go away, swallowed his losses, and let the Erie go. The most powerful businessman in America had been fought to a standstill by 3 swindlers and a cooperative government. And the winners, they barely paused. Jay Gould took control of the Erie and kept right on going. Within a year, he'd try something even bigger, a scheme to corner the entire nation's supply of gold and nearly break the American economy in a single day. But that's the next story. The lesson of the Erie War is the uncomfortable one. We like to think the richest man always wins. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes the man who wins is just the one most willing to buy the referee. This is Rags to Riches, the rise and the ruin of the world's greatest fortunes. Last time, a fortune made of paper burned to ash. This time, the paper won. Next time, one of these same men reaches for all the gold in America. Subscribe and find out what happens when he grabs it. Chapter 3. The Gold Corner. On the morning of September 24, 1869, two men set out to own all the gold in America. Not most of it, all of it. Enough to name their own price for the metal that every dollar, every debt, every shipload of grain in the country was measured against, and force the whole economy to buy it back from them. For a few hours that morning, it worked. The price went vertical. Fortunes were made in minutes. And then, in about 15 minutes, it all came down and took a piece of the country with it. They called that day Black Friday. The first one. This is the story of how one quiet man tried to corner the gold supply of the United States, and how he got so close he had to reach inside the White House to do it. You've met him before. Jay Gould, small, silent, and the most dangerous mind on Wall Street. A year earlier, he'd beaten Cornelius Vanderbilt for the Erie Railroad by printing stock faster than the richest man in America could buy it. Beating a titan wasn't enough. Gould wanted to beat the market itself. To understand his plan, you have to understand gold in 1869. The country ran on two kinds of money: paper dollars, greenbacks, printed during the Civil War, and gold, the real thing, that the paper was supposed to be worth. The two traded against each other every day in one room in Manhattan, the gold room, and that price, the price of gold in greenbacks, quietly set everything. The cost of imports, the value of the harvest, whether American grain could be sold abroad. Now, the amount of gold actually available for trading in New York was surprisingly small. A pool of maybe $15–20 million. Small enough that a man with enough nerve and enough credit could try to buy it all, corner it, and make everyone who owed gold come begging to him. There was only one force big enough to crush a corner like that: the United States Treasury. The government sat on a mountain of gold, and if the price ever spiked, it could simply sell, flood the market, break the corner, ruin whoever was holding. So Gould's real problem was never buying the gold. It was making sure that when he did, the government would keep its own gold locked in the vault. He needed someone inside the government. He found something better, someone inside the family. His name was Abel Corbin, an old Wall Street operator, sharp and oily, and, crucially, the new brother-in-law of the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero, 2 years in the White House and famously trusting of the men around him. Gould went to work on Corbin. He let him in on the gold trades, promised him profit for no risk, and through Corbin he got what he actually wanted: a seat near the president. When Grant came through New York, Gould was there, on Corbin's arm, on Jim Fisk's steamship, at the dinner table. And at those dinners, Gould made his case, gently as economics. High gold, he argued, was good for the country. It helped farmers, helped exports, moved the harvest. If gold rose, everyone won. So the government shouldn't interfere. The government shouldn't sell. He was planting a single idea in the one head that could ruin him: leave the gold alone. And to be sure, he reached one level deeper. The man who would actually give the order to sell government gold was the assistant treasurer in New York, Daniel Butterfield. Gould saw to it that Butterfield was taken care of, alone, a stake in the game, so that if the Treasury ever did decide to move, Gould would hear about it first, before anyone else on Wall Street, before the market. The trap was set: buy the gold, keep the government still, and keep one ear inside the vault. Then Gould started buying, quietly at first, through a web of brokers, so no one could see how much one man held. The price of gold began to climb, and to turn the climb into a stampede, He brought in his old partner, the loud one, Jim Fisk. Where Gould was a whisper, Fisk was a brass band. He bought gold openly, boasted about it, told everyone who'd listened that gold was going to the moon and the government was on their side. The gold room caught fire. The price climbed, 135, 140, 143, and every man who had promised to deliver gold he didn't own started to sweat. But up in Washington, the idea Gould had planted was dying. Grant was no fool. He began to sense he was being used, that his own brother-in-law had put him at the center of a swindle. The final tell was small and human. Corbin's wife wrote a too-eager letter to the president's household about the family's gold position. Grant read it and understood everything. He had his wife write back one line, "Get out of the gold now," and he quietly made the decision Gould had spent all summer trying to prevent. If the price kept climbing, the Treasury would sell. Here is the cold part. Through his man Butterfield, Gould got wind of it, that Grant had turned, that the government was about to break the corner days before the public did. And Jay Gould did not warn anyone. Not the market. Not the men who'd bought in on his say-so. Not even Fisk, the partner still out on the floor screaming at people to buy. Gould turned around, and while Fisk pushed the price higher, he began quietly, ruthlessly, selling his own gold into his partner's mania. Friday, September 24, 1869. The gold room was a riot. The indicator climbed past 150, past 155, toward 160. Men were ruined and made and ruined again in the space of a sentence. Outside, a crowd filled the street. The whole country's finances were swinging on one room. And then a single piece of news crossed the wire. The Treasury of the United States would sell $4 million in gold. The mountain had moved. In minutes, the price of gold collapsed, 160, 140, 133, straight down through every fortune built on the way up. The corner was over. Wall Street cratered with it. Brokerages failed, the stock market crashed, and the shock rolled out into the real country. Freight stopped, credit froze, and for months, farmers half a continent away paid for a scheme in a single room in Manhattan. Fisk, out on the floor with contracts to buy gold at prices that no longer existed, simply refused to honor them, hid behind lawyers and a friendly judge, and walked away, shrugging. As he put it, nothing lost save honor. And Gould had been selling for days. When the smoke cleared and men were counting their ruin, he walked out of Black Friday quietly, and quietly rich. He had cornered the gold of the United States, reached inside the president's own family to do it, and when it broke, he was already gone. This is rags to riches, the rise and the ruin of the world's greatest fortunes. The Match King built his empire on paper. The Erie ring won theirs by printing it. And Jay Gould nearly bought the ground the whole economy stood on. Different men, one lesson. The fastest way to beat a game is to own the person keeping score. Next time, a man who didn't corner a market for a day, but quietly took an entire industry and held it for 40 years. Subscribe and watch him do it one barrel at a time. Chapter 4. The Standard. A man sits alone in his office in Cleveland in the winter of 1872, reading a single sheet of paper that has just ended his life's work. It's an offer to buy his oil refinery. The price is low, far below what he built it for. And the quiet man across the desk has explained without raising his voice that the offer will only get worse, that the railroads have already turned against him, that he can take stock in the new company, or he can take cash, or he can watch his refinery become worthless. Those are the choices. Within 3 months, 22 of the 26 oil refiners in the city of Cleveland will sign a version of that same page. The man holding the pen was 32 years old, and this is the story of how he went on to own almost the entire oil industry of the United States, 90% of it in a country that was supposed to make that impossible. Not in a day, like the gold men. Over 40 years, legally, one barrel at a time. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and to understand him, you have to drop one thing you assume about how empires like his get built. He was not a wildcatter. He never struck it rich in an oil field. He didn't shout, didn't gamble, didn't drink. He was a bookkeeper by training, a devout, silent, almost frighteningly patient man who kept his own accounts to the penny and prayed on Sundays. He found the oil business loud, chaotic, and wasteful, and he decided very early that he was going to make it his. So here is the question this whole story is really about, and I want you to hold it the entire way through. How do you come to own 90% of an entire American industry, quietly, without ever inventing a better product, without outdrilling anyone, and without, at the start, breaking a single law that existed when you began? The answer is not oil. That's the trick of it. Almost no one was looking in the right place. Rockefeller was. In 1870, he took his refineries and incorporated them into one company in Ohio, with a deliberately plain and reassuring name. He called it Standard Oil. Everyone else in the oil rush was fighting over the same two things: where to drill and how to refine. Rockefeller looked past both, at the one thing every last barrel had to touch no matter who owned it: the railroad. Oil was worthless in the ground. It only became money when it moved, from the wells to the refineries to the cities, and all of it moved by rail. Whoever controlled the movement of oil controlled the oil, and the railroads, it turned out, were desperate for one thing Rockefeller could give them: steady, enormous, predictable volume. So he made them a deal in secret. Standard Oil would guarantee the railroads a flood of freight every day like clockwork. In return, the railroads would charge Standard a lower rate than they charged anyone else, a rebate. That alone would have been fatal to his rivals. But the contracts went further, into something that, when the public finally saw it, they refused to believe was real. It was called a drawback. Under it, when a competitor shipped his own oil on that railroad, the railroad took part of what that competitor paid and handed it to Standard Oil. Read that again. Every barrel a rival shipped, he paid a fee to the company trying to destroy him. His own sales funded his executioner. The paper that arranged it was a scheme called the South Improvement Company, and when its contracts leaked in 1872, the outrage was so total that the charter was killed within months. But it didn't matter. The threat alone had already done the work. That was the winter the refiners of Cleveland signed. Rockefeller had shown them the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not a fight anyone could win. Now here is the part that should unsettle you, because a lower price is not, by itself, a monopoly. Rockefeller's real edge was that he could see. Standard Oil built something no competitor had: information. Through clerks in the railroad freight offices, through its own agents in every oil town, Standard quietly tracked the shipments of its rivals. How many barrels an independent refiner sent last week, where they went, who bought them. He knew his competitors' businesses, sometimes better than they knew them themselves. And so, when a stubborn independent refused to sell and tried to build up trade in some far-off city, a Standard Oil salesman would already be there, waiting, cutting the price in that one town, on that one product, just long enough to starve him out, while Standard's profits everywhere else covered the loss without a flinch. Ida Tarbell, the journalist who would one day take this whole empire apart on paper, grew up in the oil regions. Her own father was one of the small men ruined in that first Cleveland winter. Decades later, she wrote the sentence that defined him: "They had never played fair, and that ruined their greatness for me." The detection was perfect. It was what he chose to do with it that made him the most feared man in America. By the late 1870s, Rockefeller controlled the refineries, but he was still, technically, a tenant. He rode on the railroad's rails, and a partner that powerful can always become a rival. So the independents tried the obvious thing. They tried to escape him. They built a pipeline, a long steel line to pump crude oil straight over the mountains to the sea, bypassing the railroads and Standard entirely. For a moment, it looked like freedom. Rockefeller's answer was to stop being a customer of the movement of oil and to own it. Standard began laying its own pipelines, thousands of miles of them, until it controlled not just the refining of American oil, but the very veins it flowed through. The company that had beaten its rivals by renting the railroad's power now simply replaced the railroads. The choke point that had made him, he bought outright and closed his hand around it. By around 1880, Less than 10 years after that first Cleveland offer, Standard Oil refined roughly 90% of the oil in the United States. The question from the beginning was how you take an entire industry. Here is where he had, in fact, taken it. But he had a new problem, and it was the law. Because what Rockefeller had built wasn't supposed to be possible. State laws forbade one company from owning companies in other states. On paper, a machine this big could not legally exist. And Standard was drawing exactly the kind of attention that gets machines like it broken apart. The solution didn't come from an oil man. It came from a lawyer named Samuel Dodd, and it may be the most consequential piece of paper in this entire series. In 1882, Dodd drew up an agreement that took the stock of some 40 Standard-controlled companies, scattered across dozens of states, and placed all of it into the hands of 9 men, to be held, the document's own word, in trust. The companies stayed legally separate. Technically, none of them owned the others, but 9 trustees now voted all of them as one. It was a single mind wearing 40 masks. They called the arrangement a trust, and that is the reason we now call the laws written to stop it antitrust laws. Rockefeller hadn't just built a monopoly. He'd invented the legal costume that let a monopoly walk around in daylight, calling itself something else. For a while it worked perfectly, and that was the problem. Because a machine that can't be seen and can't be stopped and touches the price of light and heat in every home in the country, eventually people stop asking how it works and start asking who let this happen. The reckoning didn't come from a rival or a senator. It came from that girl from the oil regions, grown up. Ida Tarbell spent years doing the one thing Standard Oil never expected anyone to bother with. She read the paper, the old contracts, the court records, the shipping ledgers, the leaked rebate schedules, the whole trail of documents the company had assumed no one would ever assemble. Beginning in 1902, she published it, piece by piece, in McClure's magazine, 19 installments, a quiet, devastating, fully sourced autopsy of exactly how the machine was built. The public finally saw the drawbacks, the spying, the town-by-town executions in black and white, and the government at last moved. In 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it broken apart, shattered into 34 separate companies. It was meant to be the end of him. It was the single greatest windfall of his life. Because Rockefeller owned about a quarter of every one of those 34 new companies. Freed from the trust and sold on the open market, their shares soared and his fortune roughly doubled. The pieces were worth far more than the whole. Breaking the monopoly made the monopolist the richest man the modern world had ever seen. A fortune that, measured against the economy of his day, no billionaire since has ever touched. Those 34 fragments, by the way, never really died. You have bought gasoline from their descendants. We just call them Exxon now, and Mobil, and Chevron. This is rags to riches, the rise and the ruin of the world's greatest fortunes. The Match King built his empire on paper. The Erie ring printed theirs. J. Gould cornered the gold for a single day. And John D. Rockefeller did the thing all of them only reached for. He took an entire industry, quietly, and held it for 40 years, by owning the one road everyone else was forced to travel. So, how do you legally swallow an industry? You don't fight for the product everyone's watching. You find the choke point no one is, and you close your hand around it, and you wait. The most dangerous man in the room is almost never the loudest. He's the one keeping the books. Somewhere in this video, a single gold drop of oil is hiding a tiny barrel inside it. First person to drop the timestamp in the comments wins. Next time, the man who did all of this again, in a new century, with steel. Subscribe and watch an empire get built out of the thing that holds the world up. Chapter 5. The Scheme. This piece of paper is worth exactly 1 cent. It's called an international reply coupon. You buy it at a post office in one country, and someone in another country can trade it for postage stamps. That's all it does. That is everything it does. In 1920, this 1 cent piece of paper took nearly $15 million out of the city of Boston. Because a man with a wonderful smile stood in front of it and made a promise. Hand me your savings, and in 45 days I'll hand them back. plus half again, 50%, guaranteed. You would have said no. You'd like to think you would have said no. The road to that promise runs from a card table on an immigrant ship, to police lines outside a Boston office, to a single column of arithmetic in a newspaper, and it ends in a charity ward in Rio de Janeiro, and it turns on one detail almost nobody thought to check. He wasn't actually buying the coupons. Charles Ponzi stepped off a ship from Italy in 1903 with $2.50 in his pocket. He'd left home with about 200. The rest, he cheerfully admitted, was lost to card games on the crossing. I landed with $250 in cash, he liked to say, and $1 million in hopes. Remember that line? He was always better at the second half of it. For 16 years, America told him no. He washed dishes and slept on the restaurant floor. He was fired from a waiter's job for shortchanging the customers. In Montreal, he found work at a bank built for Italian immigrants, and when it collapsed, he signed a name that wasn't his on a check and went to a Quebec prison. He wrote home to his mother that he'd taken a splendid job as an assistant to the warden. Crossing back into the United States, he was caught helping smuggle Italian immigrants over the border. 2 more years, federal this time. Small cons, small sentences, but notice what survived every failure untouched. The pressed suit, the walking stick, the smile. The smile never went to prison. By the summer of 1919, he was 37, married to a good woman named Rose, running a one-desk office in Boston that sold nothing in particular. Then a letter arrived from Spain, and folded inside it was a piece of paper he had never seen before. Now do what he did. Sit at that desk. It's your desk now. The letter is from a businessman in Madrid, and he's enclosed an international reply coupon, prepaid postage, so that you, the stranger, can afford to write him back. He paid about 1 cent for it in Spain, but when you carry it to a Boston post office, they hand you 6 cents in American stamps. 6 for 1. No law broken. Postage rates were fixed by treaty before the war. Then the war wrecked Europe's currencies, and the treaty didn't notice. A dying lira against a fixed stamp price, free money, signed by governments. So here's the pitch, and the pitch is true. Buy coupons cheap in Rome or Madrid, redeem them in Boston, and the arithmetic pays you 500% before expenses. It's not a scam. It's a loophole. And you'd tell your neighbor. That's the point. In December 1919, he hung a name on it. The Securities Exchange Company, and put the promise on paper. 50% interest in 90 days. Then he paid his first notes in 45. The scheme's opening move was to over-deliver. What he told no one was the other half of the arithmetic. Moving coupons at that scale, buying across Europe, shipping, redeeming penny by penny, was impossible, and he knew it within weeks. It didn't matter, because by then the second investor was paying the first. The coupon didn't have to work. It only had to explain. The first investors got paid, in full, early some of them, and that was the last day the scheme ever needed selling. Because now you're back in it. Your barber doubled his money, he shows you the cash. The policeman who was sent to look into the operation put his own savings in on the way out. Your savings earn 5% a year at the bank. The line on School Street earns 50 in 45 days, and every person who's walked out of that office has been paid. So Boston queued, down the stairs, out the door, around the block. On the best days, the clerks gave up on the ledgers and stacked the money in desk drawers, in closets, in wastepaper baskets. By the 1st of July, the Securities Exchange Company was taking in $1 million a week. At the peak, more than 2, from 30,000 ordinary depositors. And Ponzi went shopping, a controlling stake in the Hanover Trust Bank. The immigrant teller now owned the Marble Lobby, a 12-room house out in Lexington, and a first-class cabin on a liner from Italy because his mother was going to arrive in America the way her son never had. In July, the Boston Post put him on the front page, and the tone was admiration. The Wizard of School Street. The lines doubled overnight. But that headline did one other thing. It reached the desk of the one kind of man the scheme could not survive. A man who could count. The Post's publisher, Richard Grosier, didn't buy it, and he asked the most respected financial analyst in the country, Clarence Barron, to look. Barron didn't accuse anyone of anything. He did division in public. For the Securities Exchange Company to back what it owed, there would have to be roughly 160 million postal reply coupons moving through the system. The number actually in circulation worldwide was about 27,000. And one line, quietly devastating: Ponzi kept his own money in ordinary banks. A man with a machine that pays 50% does not park his fortune at 5. The Post printed the arithmetic on July 26th. No accusation, no adjectives, a column of numbers, and Boston did what cities do when the numbers stop adding. It ran. Now you're in one more line, the same office, the same stairs, except this time you're here to take your money out because the paper says the wizard is a fraud, and around you the crowd is angry and scared. And down the line comes the man himself, cream suit, straw hat, the smile. He's sent out for coffee and donuts, and he's handing them to the people withdrawing their life savings, cracking jokes, taking his time. Inside, the tellers are paying every claim in full. No arguments, no delays, cash on the counter. And you watch it happen. People reach the window, take their money, and put it back. If he can pay, the paper must be wrong. The crowd that came to gut him ends up cheering him on the sidewalk. That is the moment this whole story exists for. The arithmetic was public, the impossibility was printed, and belief held anyway, because by now nobody in that line was invested in coupons. They were invested in him. Hope, at 50%, guaranteed. It didn't fall to the crowd. It fell from inside. His own publicity man, William McMasters, hired to polish the legend, got a look at the books and found no coupons, and notes coming due with nothing behind them. On August 2nd, the Post ran his confession for him. Declares Ponzi is now hopelessly insolvent. The auditors confirmed the whole ran to millions. On August 12th, Ponzi surrendered to federal agents. Auditors went looking for the mountain of coupons at the bottom of it all. They found $61 worth. $61 against millions. There was never anything under the smile. After that, the fall runs quick. Federal prison for mail fraud. State charges behind it. Out on appeal, he surfaced in Florida selling underwater land. Value guaranteed to triple in 60 days. 60 days, 45 days. The man had exactly one song. Caught again, he jumped bail, shaved his head, grew a moustache, and was pulled off an Italy-bound freighter in New Orleans. In 1934, the government finished the voyage for him and deported him. He drifted to Rio de Janeiro, kept the books for an airline until the war took the route, and on a January night in 1949, he died in a charity ward with $75 to his name. $250 in, $75 out. The rest was never really money. The people in the lines eventually got back less than 30 cents on the dollar over years of lawsuits. And the coupon? Still 1 cent. It was never the machine. It was the alibi, the sliver of true that lets a person hand over money they already wanted to hand over. The same promise comes back every generation in new clothes. Stocks in the 20s, funds in the 80s, tokens now, always the same naked sentence underneath. Enormous return, no risk, guaranteed. When you hear it, you're being offered a place in that line, coffee in hand. Sure, the paper's wrong. He wasn't even the first. A New Yorker ran the same game 20 years before him. But Charles Ponzi smiled better. So it's his name we gave the crime. Somewhere in this episode, a 1-cent coupon is hiding in a frame where it has no business being. Drop the timestamp in the comments when you spot it. And if stories about money, power, and the people who bend both are your thing, subscribe. Next time, a man who sold the biggest company on earth at the exact perfect moment and then gave every dollar of it away. This is Rags to Riches. Chapter 6. The Gospel of Wealth. August 1919. A summer estate in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts. The man dying upstairs was once, by one famous account, the richest human being on earth. His accountants know something the obituaries won't lead with. The fortune is almost gone, not lost, not stolen, not gambled away in some final madness, spent deliberately on the strangest project a rich man has ever attempted. Two things are missing from this room. The money is one. The other is a letter. Months ago, the old man wrote to the partner who helped him build it all, asking to see him one last time before the end. No reply has come. The road to this bedroom runs from a cotton mill that paid $1.20 a week, through a river battle that stained his name forever, to a scrap of paper worth $480 million, and then through the hardest thing he ever tried to do: give every dollar of it away. It starts with a boy in Scotland listening to machines eat his father's life. Dunfermline, Scotland, Andrew Carnegie's father wove linen by hand at a loom in the family's own cottage, a proud trade, a skilled trade. Then the steam looms arrived. They did not negotiate. By 1848, the hand loom was worthless, and so, in the market's cold arithmetic, was his father. The family sold what was left, borrowed the rest, and spent 7 weeks crossing the Atlantic to a mill town outside Pittsburgh. Andrew was 12. Watch what the machines just taught him. He will spend his whole life on the winning side of that lesson. At 13, he went to work as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, tending the spools on the spinning frames for $1.20 per week. Whatever you did to earn money this week, it beat that. He never forgot a minute of it, and built the rest of his life to make sure he'd never repeat one. The way out was a telegraph office, a messenger job, $2.50 a week, and the boy did something the grown operators around him mostly couldn't. He learned to read the wire by ear. No paper tape, just the clicks, straight into words. One of a handful of people in the country who could do it. Talent like that gets noticed. Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad hired the 17-year-old as his personal telegrapher at $35 a month. Carnegie later admitted he couldn't imagine what he could ever do with so much money. Then Scott offered him something better than a salary. A tip, 10 shares of Adams Express. The Carnegies had no $500, so his mother mortgaged the house they had crossed an ocean to own. A few months later, an envelope arrived holding a $10 dividend check. Money he had not worked 12 hours a day for, money the money had made. Eureka! He shouted. Here's the goose that lays the golden eggs. Remember that goose. It is the engine of everything that follows, and at the end of this story, it becomes his enemy. Sleeping cars, iron bridges, a lucky strike of Pennsylvania oil. Soon his investments earned more in a month than his railroad salary paid in a year, and in 1872, in an English steelworks, he watched a Bessemer converter turn iron into steel in a hurricane of sparks, and reportedly rushed home crying that the day of iron had passed. He bet everything on it. He built his great mill outside Pittsburgh in the teeth of a financial panic. While everyone else hid, materials were cheap, and he named it the Edgar Thomson Works, after the railroad president he most wanted as a customer. The flattery worked. The first order was 2,000 steel rails. His system was simple, and it never changed. Hire men better than yourself. Watch the costs down to the half cent. Profits, his motto went, take care of themselves. And every time the economy collapsed, build. By 1900, one company, his, produced more steel than all of Great Britain. Everyone knows what the steel built. Fewer ask what it cost. The price has a name. It's Homestead. 1892. At the Homestead Mill, the union's contract expires, and Carnegie sails for a holiday in Scotland, leaving his partner, Henry Clay Frick, with a plan they both understood. Frick cuts the offer, locks the workers out, and rings the mill with fences topped with barbed wire. Before dawn on the 6th of July, 2 barges come up the Monongahela carrying roughly 300 armed Pinkerton agents. The town is waiting on the bank. Someone fires. The battle lasts all day. At least 10 men die, 7 workers, 3 Pinkertons, before the agents surrender and are marched, beaten, through the town. 8,500 state militiamen take the mill, strikebreakers take the jobs. By winter, the Union is dead, and the 12-hour day settles back over the steel towns like soot. It will not lift for 30 years. And Carnegie. 6 years earlier, he had published essays defending a worker's right to organize. He'd written, in his own words, "Thou shalt not take thy neighbor's job." Now, with his own mill smoking, the friend of labor said nothing, publicly. Privately, he cabled Frick, "We are with you to the end." The world never let him wash it out. Every library he built after this carries a shadow. He gave books to working men, whose 12-hour shifts left no time to read them. December 1900, a New York dinner in honor of Charles Schwab, Carnegie's brilliant young company president. Schwab stands and paints a picture. One steel company to supply the world. In the audience, the most powerful banker alive, John Pierpont Morgan, listens for 90 minutes. Afterward, he wants one number, Carnegie's price. Schwab finds the old man on the golf course. The next morning, Carnegie takes a pencil and a scrap of paper and writes a figure. Schwab carries the scrap downtown. Morgan glances at it once. "I accept this price. $480 million. No lawyers in the room, no haggling, not even a contract, a pencil note for the biggest industrial deal the world had ever seen. The merger it created, United States Steel, became the first billion-dollar company in history. Carnegie's personal share, some $225 million in gold bonds." Morgan came uptown, shook his hand and said, "Mr. Carnegie, I want to congratulate you on being the richest man in the world." He was probably wrong. There was an oil man with a bigger fortune, but no one in the room was counting that day. Years later, on a ship, Carnegie confessed he should have asked for $100 million more. Morgan's reply, "Well, you would have got it if you had." 65 years old, out at the exact top. Most stories end here. His hardest chapter was just starting. Here is the strangest fact about the sale. He had announced the whole plan 12 years earlier. In 1889, at the height of his power, Carnegie published an essay arguing that a rich man's fortune belongs to the community, that he should die having given it back, or face what Carnegie predicted would be the public's verdict. The man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. Now he had to live up to it, and he discovered the trap no one had ever hit at this scale, the goose. His bonds paid 5%, over $10 million a year, arriving whether he wanted it or not. To die poor, he didn't just have to give away a mountain, he had to outgive a mountain that was growing. He attacked it like a steel man. Free public libraries, 2,509 of them, on 3 continents. A concert hall in New York that still carries his name. A fund with medals for ordinary people who die saving strangers. Pensions that rescued America's underpaid college teachers. A gleaming palace of peace at The Hague, built to make war obsolete. 10 years after the sale, he counted what was left. More than $150 million. The interest was beating him. So in 1911, the great industrialist admitted defeat and industrialized his surrender. He poured the bulk of everything left into a foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, built to keep giving after his hands stopped. He had automated generosity, the way he had automated steel. 2 debts refused to settle. The first was Frick. Their partnership had ended in fury. Carnegie tried to force him out at book value, roughly $5 million for a stake worth 6 times that. Frick sued and won a settlement near 30. They never spoke again. In the spring of 1919, the dying Carnegie sent his secretary to Frick with a letter asking to meet one last time. The story goes that Frick crumpled it and answered, "Tell him I'll see him in hell, where we both are going." The second was history itself. His Palace of Peace opened in August 1913. 11 months later, Europe marched into the bloodiest war ever fought. The man who believed money could fix anything watched his dearest purchase fail completely. In his memoirs, his final line trails off at the summer of 1914. The world convulsed by war as never before. He never wrote another page. Andrew Carnegie died on the 11th of August 1919 in his bed at Shadowbrook. Frick followed him in December. If they ever finished their conversation, it wasn't here. The executors totaled the ledger, given away, roughly $350 million, 9 of every 10 he had. The rest, the goose's last eggs, went to the foundation to finish the job. The Bobbin boy came as close to dying broke as any rich man ever has, on purpose. A century later, when billionaires sign a pledge to give away half their fortunes, they are reading from his script, trap, shadow, and all. The giving that can't outrun the interest, and the name no library could quite wash clean. Somewhere in this episode, a wooden bobbin is hiding in a frame where it has no business being. The timestamp goes in the comments, and if stories about money, power, and the people who bend both are your thing, subscribe. Next time, the richest woman in America, who guarded her millions by living like she was broke. This is Rags to Riches. Chapter 7. The Witch of Wall Street. There is a record book, still in print, that names the greatest miser who ever lived. The record holder is a woman. Here is the charge sheet, as the newspapers filed it, that she wore one black dress until it fell apart, that she ate her porridge cold to save the cost of heating it, that she lived in rented rooms under a false name, with no fire and no hot water, that she was worth $100 million while she did it, and that her only son lost his leg because she would not pay a doctor. That story has outlived everyone who told it. Here is the woman answering. My life is written for me down in Wall Street by people who, I assume, do not care to know one iota of the real Hetty Green. I go my own way, take no partners, risk nobody else's fortune. Therefore I am Madam Ishmael, set against every man. So let's open the ledger. Because if she was the greatest miser who ever lived, one fact has never been explained. When the money ran out in New York, the city did not go to the banks. It went to her. New Bedford, Massachusetts, the whaling city, back when whale oil lit the world, and her family owned the largest fleet in it. She was 6 when she began reading the financial pages aloud to the men of her house. By 13, she was keeping the family books. She learned the trade in the counting house at her father's elbow. In the spring of 1865, her father died. Within weeks, so did her aunt. On paper, she was suddenly one of the richest women in America. In practice, she was not. The money did not come to her. It came in trusts. Roughly $1 million she could touch. Around $5 million she could not. She would draw the income for life and never control a dollar of the principal. That is the hinge of her whole life. A woman who had kept the books since she was 13 inherited a fortune and was told, in writing, that she could not be trusted with it. So she went to court. Half her aunt's $2 million was locked in yet another trust with Hetty's name on it. Income only, no control. But Hetty produced a different will, an earlier one, leaving her everything outright, and attached to it a second page, a clause revoking any other will her aunt might ever sign, before or after, a kill switch on the future. Hetty admitted she had written that page herself. She said her aunt had signed it. The signatures were the problem, 2 of them on that page, matching the genuine signature perfectly, not closely, perfectly. So the executors did something never done before in an American courtroom. They called in mathematicians. Benjamin Pierce, the finest mathematician in the country, compared the signatures stroke by stroke and gave the court a number. The odds of 2 genuine signatures matching this exactly by chance were 1 in 2,666 million. The coincidence which has occurred here must have had its origin in an intention to produce it. It was the first time statistics were ever used as evidence in an American court. And it changed nothing, because the judge never ruled on it. The case was thrown out on something else. Under the law of the day, a surviving party could not testify about a private transaction with a dead person. Hetty's account of the bargain she claimed to have struck with her aunt was the only evidence that any bargain existed, and the court ruled she was not permitted to give it. Her testimony was struck. Without it, the judge wrote, evidence of such an agreement was entirely wanting. Bill of complaint dismissed with costs. No forgery was ever found. She was never charged with any crime. Historians still suspect she did it. They cannot prove it either. What the law had done was simpler than a verdict. It had told her she had no voice. Twice. First the trust, then the courtroom. She said it herself. I find men will take advantage of women in business in ways they would not attempt with men. I have found this particularly so in the courts, where I have been fighting all my life. So she stopped asking to be heard, and she started buying. Here is what the miser actually did with her money. She bought government bonds during the Civil War when the market was terrified the United States would never pay in gold again, and she bought them at the discount that terror created. The government paid. Then railroad bonds, mortgages, land in Chicago and San Francisco. When borrowers failed, she foreclosed without sentiment. In her own words, I buy when things are low and nobody wants them. I keep them until they go up and people are crazy to get them. That is, I believe, the secret of all successful business. And underneath it, the discipline nobody copied. She sat on enormous piles of cash. Every man on the street had his capital leveraged up. Hers sat idle and ready. Cash is not a dead asset. Cash is a loaded gun, waiting for a panic. She did all of it without ever setting foot on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Women were barred. She could not trade in person, could not sit on a board, could not vote. She owned a railroad in Texas and had to install her son as its president, because a man had to stand in front of it. She worked from a roll-top desk inside the Chemical National Bank. A reporter called it the pivot on which millions revolved. Asked whether she employed a secretary, she said, "No, I have a whole bank." And she would not be a resident of anywhere. The taxmen wanted her, and they had a theory that the law holds a woman's residence to be wherever her husband lives. They were not really hunting Hetty Green. They were trying to reach her through her marriage. So in 1895 they hauled her in and asked her, under oath, where she lived. She told them she lived nowhere, that she had no home. They asked, "Do you not live at the Hotel St. George in Brooklyn?" "No, they can't tax me there. I never lived there, only stayed there. This morning I paid my bill and left. My trunks are at Bellows Falls." "Then where," they asked, "will you sleep tonight?" "I don't know. Can't you recommend a good place?" They gave up. They gave up every time. That is why the richest woman in America lived in a $19 a month flat in Hoboken, 1 block from the ferry, with a stranger's name on the doorbell. The name was Dewey. Dewey was her dog and the one thing she spent freely on. He ate rice pudding and rare beefsteak. And the black dress. In 1899, she told a reporter she dressed badly on purpose. Dress rich, and every lawyer, every doctor, every fortune hunter in New York prices you accordingly. She took out a license to carry a pistol, and when they asked why, "Mostly to protect myself against lawyers. I'm not much afraid of burglars or highwaymen." The rags were not madness. The rags were a position. But you cannot wear armor for 50 years and have nobody bleed. In 1885, her bank collapsed. John J. Cisco and Son. It went down holding $25 million of her securities. Her husband, Edward, was the firm's largest debtor. He owed $700,000. She was its largest creditor. So the bank made her an offer. It would not release her property until she paid his debts. 18 years earlier, before she married him, she had made Edward sign away every claim to her money. Everyone thought that was cold. It was the only reason there was anything left to fight over. She paid. She hauled her securities out by the cartload, moved every dollar to the Chemical National, and moved out of the marriage. She never divorced him. She simply never trusted him again. And then there is Ned. Her son hurt his knee sledding at 8 or 9 years old. It never healed. Over the years that followed, the woman who would not buy herself a coat took him to specialist after specialist, moved cities to be near his doctors, carried him through the streets in her own arms when he could not walk, and paid. The leg came off anyway when he was 20. The newspapers said she had dressed the two of them in rags and taken him to a free clinic for the poor to dodge a fee. That story is told. It is also denied, and no document has ever settled it. What the record shows is a decade of doctors, and it was not enough. Here is the cruelty you can prove. She did all of that for her son. For herself, she would not spend a dollar. In old age, she developed a hernia, refused the operation, and pressed it down with a stick. She was hard on herself, hard on her money, and where it counted, and far too late, nowhere near as hard on her son as the newspapers needed her to be. In the spring of 1907, Hetty Green told a friend to get his money out of the Knickerbocker Trust. Her reasoning appeared on no balance sheet. "The men in that bank," she said, "are too good-looking. You mark my words." That autumn the Knickerbocker went down, the queues went round the block, and there was no money left in New York at any price. And the city of New York came to Hetty Green. She wrote them a check for $1,100,000 and took short-term city bonds in return. She had done it before. 1898, 1901, 1906. The richest city in America had a standing line of credit with a woman who lived in a $19 flat. She could have destroyed them on the price. Others were charging 40% that week. "Those to whom I loaned money got it at 6, she said. "I might just as easily have secured 40. Never in my life have I practiced usury." So the papers called her a witch. And the men who borrowed from her, the men who actually knew what she was, called her the Queen of Wall Street. Edward died in 1902. She had left him 17 years before and never divorced him, and when he lay dying, she nursed him herself, getting up 3 times a night to check the nurse was awake. She wore black for him for the rest of her life. She died on the 3rd of July, 1916, aged 81. The Times ran the number in the headline, worth $100 million, and it ended by saying, probably her life was happy. The record book still calls her the world's greatest miser. It also still prints the tale that she died arguing with a maid about skimmed milk. She died of a series of strokes. The fable is easier to sell. Her son spent his half on everything she had denied herself: a 60-room house, a yacht, the most famous sheet of misprinted stamps on earth. He died in 1936 with no children. Her daughter kept $31 million in a checking account that paid no interest, lived alone, and died in 1951 with no children. Her will turned up in a drawer among the bars of soap. It gave almost everything away, to 63 colleges, churches, and hospitals. Strangers, everyone. The Green Line simply stopped. And New York. For 30 years she told the taxmen she lived nowhere. 3 months after she died, her estate went straight to the top of the city's assessment roll, $20 million. They only had to wait until she could not answer back. Late in life, she left the Quaker faith for her husband's church. The woman who would not spend a dollar on her own body did that for one reason, so she would not have to be buried alone. They called her a witch because she did what the men did, and did it better, and would not dress for the part. Somewhere in this episode, there is a child's wooden sled, sitting in a frame where it has no business being. The timestamp goes in the comments. And if stories about money, power, and the people who bend both are your thing, subscribe. Next time, the richest man in the world, who ended his life hiding in a blacked-out room, terrified of a speck of dust. This is Rags to Riches. Chapter 8. The Locked Door. In January of 1972, 7 reporters were led into a hotel suite to interview the most famous businessman in America. They were chosen because each of them had met him years before and could recognize his voice. That was the point, because they were not allowed to see him. He spoke to them through a telephone from another room in the same building, a disembodied voice proving it was still alive. For the better part of 20 years, that was all anyone got. No photograph, no appearance. By the early 1960s, the cameras simply stopped, and one of the richest men in the world walked out of the visible record and did not come back. Editors offered rewards for a single current picture of his face. Nobody could collect. He owned an airline he never flew, a studio whose films he never sat down to watch, a city whose lights he paid for and never saw. Everyone asked what he was hiding from, out there behind the blacked-out windows. It was the wrong question. He was not hiding from something out there. He was hiding from something in here. Howard Hughes spent his whole life buying control of the world outside himself. The one thing he could never buy and never control was inside his own head. To understand the man in the dark room, you have to watch him build the fortress. Start with the money, because the money explains the man. His father invented a drill bit, a two-cone rotary bit that chewed through hard rock about 10 times faster than anything before it, and opened oil fields that had been sealed shut. And Howard Sr. did one clever thing more. He never sold the bit. He only leased it. Every driller in America paid to rent it by the day, and the money ran back to one family without end. Then the family died. His mother, when he was 16. His father, 2 years later. At 18, Howard Hughes inherited 3/4 of the company and a court that said a boy could not run it. So he had the court declare him an adult, and then he did the defining act of his life. He bought his own relatives out. Every aunt, every uncle, every cousin who held the other quarter, until he owned the whole of it. 19 years old, and he already could not stand to share. That is the pattern, and it never changes. He would rather own all of a thing than any part of a thing he could not command. The drill bit only told him he could afford it. He wanted to fly. And here is the part the later story always forgets. He was brilliant at it. Not a rich man playing pilot, a serious engineer. He built an aircraft called the H-1 Racer, designed to do one thing: go faster than any plane had ever gone. On the 13th of September, 1935, he flew it at 352 miles an hour, a world record, and only came down because he ran out of fuel and put it into a beet field. He climbed out and said he would fix it and go faster. 2 years on, he crossed the whole United States in 7.5 hours. The year after that, he flew around the world in 91 hours, 3 days and 19, less than half the record. New York gave him a ticker-tape parade up Broadway. For one summer, he was hailed like Lindbergh. This is the man at the height of his powers, precise, fearless, in total command of a machine screaming along at the edge of what was possible, every rivet of it his own design. Which is how, in 1946, the machine nearly killed him. He was testing a new spy plane over Los Angeles when a propeller failed. He came down in Beverly Hills through 3 houses. The crash collapsed a lung, broke his ribs, and burned him. They gave him even odds to live. He lived, but the man they rebuilt was in pain for the rest of his life, and for the pain they gave him codeine, which he would take in rising amounts, for the next 30 years. Remember that. The fall did not begin in a dark room. It began in a hospital bed, with a prescription. Between the records, he bought Hollywood, or tried to control it, which for him was the same thing. He made a war in the air picture, Hell's Angels, spent on it like no one ever had, then reshot the whole thing when sound arrived. When it was done, he told the newspapers it was the most expensive film ever made. It wasn't. He had simply invented the number. But he understood what the rest of the town didn't. Control the story about a thing, and you control the thing. He did it again with a Western. He engineered a special bra to shape how his young star looked on camera, and then, when the censors balked, had his own staff telephone church groups demanding the film be banned, so that half of America would queue to see what the fuss was about. He controlled the outrage the way he controlled an aircraft. And then he bought a studio outright. RKO, the only man in Hollywood to own a major one all by himself. And he ran it into the ground, pictures frozen for months over trifles, staff fired by the 100, until the studio that made King Kong barely made anything at all. He could own it. He just could not leave it alone. And the thing he owned died of his attention. By now the pattern has a shape. Whatever Howard Hughes could not control, he bought, and then he could not stop. He held an airline, TWA, for years, until the fight over how to run it went to court. And in 1966, he was forced to sell his shares. They paid him $546 million for them. It was meant to be a defeat. Instead, it handed a man already sliding into paranoia the largest pile of loose cash in the country. He took it to Las Vegas. He checked into the top floor of the Desert Inn, and when the hotel asked him to leave to make room for its high rollers, he did not leave. He bought the hotel. Then the next one, and the one after that, casino after casino, most of the empty land on the Strip. An airport, 2,000 mining claims, $300 million of Nevada, until he was the largest employer in the state. He bought the local television station so it would run films all night because he did not sleep. He was buying a city and running it, from a bed he no longer got out of. His orders were carried out by a small circle of aides who passed his written instructions along and guarded the door. One of them ran the whole Nevada operation for years and never once met him face to face. He now controlled more of the visible world than almost any private man alive, and he had stopped going outside. Here is where the story turns, and the turn is the whole of it. The same need that bought the drill bit, and the studio, and the city, the need to control every last variable, did not switch off when he lay down in the dark. It turned around. It pointed inward. He had feared germs his whole life. His mother had raised him on it, inspecting him daily, terrified of polio, teaching a small boy that the world was a surface covered in invisible things that could kill him. For decades, that fear ran underneath the genius. Now, with nothing left to conquer outside, the genius went to work on the fear. With the exact precision that had designed a record-breaking aircraft, he began to engineer a perfectly controlled world, 6 feet wide. And he wrote it all down. The instructions survive. They were called operating memoranda, and he dictated them to his staff the way he had once specified an engine. How to hand him a spoon, how to open a door, wrapping the handle in 6 to 8 layers of Kleenex so that nothing passed through to his skin. There is a memo, pages long, on how to open a can of fruit. Wash the can, soak the label off, scrub it with a brush starting 2 inches below the top, and rinse away every particle before it comes near him. This is the same mind that solved the airflow over a wing, turned now on a tin of peaches. The rooms went dark. Across a dozen cities and half a dozen countries, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, the Bahamas, Nicaragua, Acapulco, always the same room. Windows taped over, no daylight. He sat in the dark and ran films on a loop. One submarine picture he watched perhaps 150 times. The man who had owned the most precisely controlled body in America, the pilot, the athlete, stopped cutting his hair, his beard, his nails. He would not see a doctor. The codeine that began in that hospital bed he was now injecting himself, and the needles broke, and the pieces stayed in his arms. Every wall he had ever built to keep the world out was now a wall keeping him in. He controlled every variable in that room. And every variable in that room controlled him. On the 5th of April, 1976, they finally carried him onto a plane bound for a hospital. He died in the air over Texas on the way. Kidney failure. The richest patient in the world, dead of a neglect that a few dollars of care would have turned away. He was 6'4", and he weighed about 90 pounds. The body was so far gone that no one could be certain it was him. They took his fingerprints and sent them to the FBI to confirm that the man was Howard Hughes. The fortress had erased even his face. He left no will that anyone could trust. Forgeries surfaced by the dozen, one carried by a gas station owner who swore Hughes had left him a share and which a court ruled a fake. In the end, $2.5 billion went to 22 cousins, most of whom had never met him. But the strangest part of the fortune was already gone. Years before, in 1953, Hughes had quietly signed his entire aircraft company over to a medical research foundation with his name on it. After he died, that foundation sold the company for $5.2 billion and became the largest private funder of medical research in America. The man who spent his life terrified of disease, who died filthy in a dark room trying to escape it, left a fortune that now, every day, pays for the science that fights it. He could not control that either. Control was never the cure. Control was the disease. Somewhere in this episode, there is a single clean box of tissues sitting in a frame where a triumphant man should be. The timestamp goes in the comments. And if stories about money, power, and the people it breaks are your thing, subscribe. Next time, the man who invented the modern world, the current in your walls, right now, who died alone in a cheap hotel room, with nothing but the pigeons. This is Rags to Riches, Chapter 9. The Uncollected Fortune. Every fortune in this series ends in a ledger. This one begins with a single piece of paper. 1888. A licensing agreement, a few pages long, with one clause that matters, $2.50 for every horsepower of alternating current electricity sold in America. Forever. Look around the room you're in. Count the things that are plugged in, the lights, the screen you're watching, the charger by the bed. That clause covers every one of them. Run it forward across the electric century, and it becomes, on paper, the most valuable contract a human being has ever signed. It no longer exists, and the man it belonged to died alone in a hotel room, his rent paid by another man's pity. This is the story of what happened to that piece of paper. There is no document for the beginning. That is the point of the beginning. He owned nothing but the idea. Nikola Tesla was born in 1856 in a village on the military frontier of the Austrian Empire, the son of a Serbian priest. The family said he arrived at midnight in the middle of a lightning storm. It's a legend. He kept it. He understood, better than anyone alive, that a story is also a kind of machine. The idea came to him, as he told it, in a park in Budapest, at sunset, in 1882. A motor with no brushes and no sparks, driven by a current that reverses itself many times a second. A field of force, spinning in space. He said he saw it whole, and sketched it in the dust of the path with a stick. 2 years later, he walked off a ship in New York with, as he told it for the rest of his life, 4 cents in his pocket, and went to work for the most famous inventor on Earth. It lasted 6 months. There is a story he told about that too, a promised $50,000 for redesigning Edison's dynamos, and when he asked for it, a laugh, "You don't understand our American humor." Whatever was actually said, he quit. And then the man carrying the 20th century around in his head spent a winter digging ditches. $2 a day. He would remember the foreman's pity for the rest of his life. The first document arrives in 1888. In May of that year, Tesla stood in front of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers and showed them the motor from the park in Budapest, running. By morning, he was the most talked-about engineer in America, and one industrialist was listening carefully, George Westinghouse of Pittsburgh, the one man betting his entire company on alternating current. The deal, as it has come down to us, $60,000 in cash and stock, a salary to consult in Pittsburgh, and the clause, $2.50 for every horsepower his patents produced. Not a sale, a royalty. A meter bolted to the future itself. It needed defending. Thomas Edison had wired his empire for direct current, and he did not intend to lose it politely. What followed was one of the ugliest campaigns in the history of American business. Dogs and horses electrocuted for reporters to teach the public that the rival current was the killer's current. When New York State built the first electric chair, it was wired deliberately with Westinghouse machines. They wanted a new verb in the language, Westinghoused. The answer came in Chicago in 1893, the World's Fair, lit end to end by the Tesla system, hundreds of thousands of lamps burning at once, the first electric city any human being had ever seen. 27 million people walked through it. The war was over. And somewhere in a Pittsburgh ledger, a clause was quietly counting horsepower. The arrears alone were already a fortune. The second document is the one that isn't there. 1891. A banking panic reaches across the Atlantic, credit tightens like a fist, and Westinghouse Electric, overbuilt, overextended, at war with Edison on every front, is suddenly weeks from going under. The bankers who can save it name their condition, and it is not negotiable. The royalty goes, or the company does. So George Westinghouse rode to New York to tell Tesla himself. Here the record splits in two. The legend, told by his first biographer, and retold for 80 years, is that Tesla listened, asked whether Westinghouse had believed in him when no one else would, took the contract from the desk, and tore it in half. The ledger tells it colder, a negotiated release, and some years later a check, $216,000, for the patents outright. The exact terms have never been firmly established. Believe whichever version you like. The outcome is identical. He let go of the largest royalty ever written to save the one man who had bet on him, and the meter on the 20th century kept running, for everyone but him. 2 years later, his system took Niagara Falls. The generators turned, Buffalo lit up in the night, and the age of electric power began in earnest, his field of force spinning in every machine. His share of it, nothing. The third document is a mortgage. What money Tesla did have, he spent the only way he ever spent it, on the next future. In Colorado Springs, he built a laboratory that threw man-made lightning 100 feet across the room and filled notebooks with the physics of the Earth itself as a conductor. Then he came back east to build the big one, Wardenclyffe, a tower on Long Island financed with $150,000 of John Pierpont Morgan's money to send messages across the ocean without wires, and in Tesla's real plan, the part he saved for later, power. Electricity itself through the Earth to anyone with a receiver. Then Marconi crossed the Atlantic first, with equipment a fraction as ambitious and a fraction the cost. And Morgan, looking at a tower whose product no meter could measure, declined to send another dollar. History attached a line to that refusal. If anyone can draw the power, where do we put the meter? There is no record he ever said it. He didn't need to. The arithmetic said it for him. The money died. The tower stood on the Long Island shore for a decade, unfinished, while its inventor's bills piled up at the Waldorf Astoria, and the endings write themselves from here. To settle the hotel debt, Tesla signed the deed to Wardenclyffe over to the Waldorf's proprietor. In 1917, the new owners dynamited the tower and sold it for scrap. The machine meant to electrify the Earth went to settle a hotel invoice. That same year, the engineering establishment gave Tesla its highest honor. They called it the Edison Medal. The fourth document is a rent ledger, and the strangest act of the story. A procession of Manhattan hotels, each a little cheaper than the last. An old man, still immaculate, feeding the pigeons outside the public library every day at the same hour. There was one, a white one, he nursed in his own room when she was hurt. He told his biographer he had loved her as a man loves a woman. Once a year, on his birthday, reporters climbed up to his suite, and he sold them tomorrow, beams of force, messages from other worlds, and the papers ran the eccentric alongside the genius and called it a story. Then, in 1934, the quietest entry in the whole ledger. The Westinghouse Corporation, the company his surrendered clause had saved, began paying Nikola Tesla $125 a month, plus his rent at the Hotel New Yorker. They called it a consulting fee. It was charity, dressed carefully, so the proudest man in New York would never have to hear the word. The royalty had come back to him as pity. On the 7th of January, 1943, a maid ignored the Do Not Disturb card that had hung on the door of room 3327 for 2 days, and found him, 86 years old. Within days, government men had sealed his trunks and carried off his papers, hunting a weapon that was never there. Their own expert read it all and found speculation, not a weapon. Even his ghost was audited. So closed the ledger. Historians who have run the arithmetic on that clause, $2.50 on every horsepower across the century that electrified the world, come out in the billions. First billionaire territory. Every version of the sum is larger than any fortune in this series. But here is what the arithmetic misses. Every other man in this catalogue held on. They clutched their fortunes to the end, and the fortunes buried them. Tesla opened his hand, and his is the only fortune in the catalogue still paying out, not to an estate. To you. Turn off the lights in this room and count what keeps humming in the dark. Every one of those is the receipt. The fortune was never lost. It was uncollected. Somewhere back in the brightest frame of this story, at the very summit of his triumph, an old friend of his poorest years is already waiting. Find her and put the timestamp in the comments. And if these stories of fortunes made and lost are worth your time, subscribe. This is Rags to Riches.